Howdy, and welcome to my Stack Up videos series for 2024 season. I will start off with the back of the pack and work my way forward, so you get to see Stake, Kick, Sauber F1 team starting off at the bat since they were last in the constructors' standings. Now this kind of goes through and compares the team and the drivers to those that are around them in the Drivers' Championship and the Constructors' Championship in a kind of a little detailed informational session. As you can see here, we have Stake, Kick, Sauber F1 team in the 10th position. They had an average starting position of 16 and an average finishing position of 15. So they didn't do completely bad overall in the series, but it wasn't quite up to par to get them any kind of points to get them up in the standings. They also had 4 DNFs. That's just did not finish. That's not necessarily crashes. That's just they didn't finish the race for some reason or another. So they either had a part failure or an issue going on, or possibly a wreck as well that caused them to not finish the race. So that is concluded there. So we will go down and break it down by the drivers. So we have Valtteri Bottas, who finished 22nd overall in the driver standing since we had 24 drivers this season. Not quite dead last, but not far from the bottom either. He averaged ranked starting position was 15th, and his average finishing position was 16th. So he lost a position overall in the season due to his averages out. He had 2 DNFs throughout the season, so not too terrible, but not the best that I've seen. And we have Jon Carpenter, who finished 20th, 2 places ahead of his teammate. The average starting position was 17th, so farther back than Valtteri Bottas, but his finishing position was averaged ahead of Valtteri Bottas in that 15th position. He also had 2 DNFs. So again, not the worst I've seen, but not the best I've seen. So a decent amount. I'm not sure if that was just because that were so slow or they were out of the fighting positions, or there was something else going on and they were just that stable of a vehicle that just was slow overall, and they were having to try to figure out how to make it faster. Without further ado, we will start off with the comparison between the Stake F1 drivers Jon Carpenter and Valtteri Bottas in the sprint races. So on the x-axis we have the finishing position for each driver, and on the y-axis we have the sprint race that they were competing in. And so as you can see, the trend lines are going up, which is bad because that means that they are getting worse throughout the season. Now you can start seeing that both of them did decently in the first sprint race and slowly got worse, and then Valtteri Bottas was starting to get better at the end of the season, whereas Jon Carpenter was still kind of trailing off into the distance. So it's kind of interesting to see this trend between the experienced driver and the somewhat newer driver in this run. So we basically have Valtteri Bottas not quite doing as well as the youngster, but then was starting to get that car turned around at the end of the season and kind of getting better in those sprint races to try to get the most out of that Stake F1 vehicle. And whereas Jon Carpenter had a big drop off, but then was slowly came back, but not quite as well as Valtteri Bottas did. And you can see that as that lines go up into the back of that quarter of the sprint races, with at Coda and Brazil starting to get slightly better, but then getting worse again at Qatar. Now we will see the same thing over here with Valtteri against Logan Sargent and Liam Lawson. So Liam Lawson was ahead of him, and Logan Sargent was finished behind him in the official standings for Valtteri Bottas, and that's why I'm comparing those 3 drivers. And again, Valtteri Bottas is in green to show off the Stake F1 colors. Logan Sargent is in blue, and Liam Lawson is in red. And this is kind of an interesting comparison since Logan Sargent only competed in 3 sprint races at the beginning of the season, and then Liam Lawson competed against 3 sprint races at the end of the season. So we kind of missed that middle section, but overall we can kind of get a general gist, even though it's not a good picture overall between those 3 drivers. As we see, again, the trend line for Valtteri Bottas was slowly getting worse throughout the sprint race season, whereas Logan Sargent was getting much better, but we have to kind of have that at the grain of salt because he only had 3 races. And those last 2 races were good or better than his first race. And so it kind of trends that trend line down. So it makes it look like he's doing better. And I think he would have been overall getting better. It's just I don't think he would have been getting that much better throughout the season to warrant him staying in the Williams. Liam Lawson, who started off bad, had a good race and then ended up bad again. So his trend line is kind of average there, straight above that, almost that 14th, a little bit above that 14th mark in that running. So he's not doing great, but he's not doing horrible either. He does need to get a little bit better on his positioning in this sprint races. So we'll have to see how that plays out next year when he joins the big brother team of Red Bull versus the RB team that he jumped in at the end of the season there. So we'll have to see how that plays out, and especially since we only had 3 races for each of those in the sprint race, it was harder to determine. Sprint race for Guan Yu Zhou comparison. And of course, we have Liam Lawson that was behind him and Franco Colapinto, which was ahead of him. And Franco only competed in the Cutter sprint race. So only has the blue dot versus everything else. So he doesn't even get a trend line in this running, but we can kind of compare those same graph numbers against Guan Yu Zhou for Liam Lawson there. So as Liam Lawson was kind of steady throughout, Guan Yu Zhou was getting worse, and we can kind of see where they ended up in those finishing positions to give us a little comparison on the sprint race between the 3 drivers. And so you can definitely see that Guan Yu Zhou was worse out of the 3 overall, even though he was ranked in the middle for that end drivers championship running. So, and again, we only had a couple of races for Franco and only a couple of races for Liam Lawson as well in that comparison, especially in the sprint races. We get a little bit better idea of how they were doing in the full GP races coming up. And you can see here that, Valtteri is again in green and Logan is in blue and Liam Lawson is in red. And so since he only had a few races at the end, trend line is kind of poorly shown here. He's showing like getting worse really quickly, but hopefully he will turn around and do better next season, especially since he's now in that Red Bull seat. And hopefully he can, really solidify that Red Bull team, even though he's going to be a backup driver for, Max Verstappen being that second driver. Hopefully he will be able to take that on and really do well. So Logan Sargent had a roller coaster race for his last, 6 races here. DNFing actually in Abu Dhabi, so I didn't quite make that. But the better comparison here, I think, is between Logan Sargent and Valtteri Bottas. They kind of had that similar trend line, going slightly better throughout the season, even though Logan Sargent seemed to have a few worse offs than Valtteri. Valtteri was doing fairly well in that, Monaco section, whereas Logan Sargent was just completely off and had too many crashes and DNFs to really put up that good of a fight for that backpack. And I think that's why he ended up being sacked partway through this season, giving a chance for some new blood to come in to that Williams team to see and compare how the new driver would do in that same situation. It's kind of interesting layout here. Valtteri doing better, but still on the same kind of a pattern trend line, looking at getting slightly better, but not where he needs to be. So hopefully Valtteri will be able to come back in the future. I know he's out of a seat for next year, but hopefully he'll be able to come back and really show us how he can do. Maybe even, sub in for one of the Mercedes and win a race. That would be kind of interesting for next season. So how did Guan Yu Zhou compare? So his are slightly the same way. We have Franco with those, 4 or 5 races at the end, as well as Liam Lawson's there. So compared to them, the trend line was looking a lot better than theirs, even though his consistency seems to be better overall since we had a better running of races throughout the whole season that he competed in. And so you can see a couple of the breaks where he had some DNFs, but you can get the feel of how Guan Yu Zhou was doing comparatively to Franco Colapinto and Liam Lawson. See Franco doing quite well around that 10th place marker, but then having several DNFs as well in his run. So it makes it a little harder for him to gauge on that. And those were fairly decent wrecks, causing Williams quite a bit of cost in repairs. So hopefully he can find a seat. I know a lot of people were looking at him early on when he joined Williams, doing quite well there. But then when these wrecks started happening, I think some of that intrigue for Franco kind of waned a little bit, thinking that maybe he is still too young and still costing too much for the team to put in a full-time seat. We'll have to see how that plays out in the future. So that's kind of an interesting layout for the GP races. So we come to the comparison for the teams. So the one team that was comparing itself against was Williams in the last place in the constructors. And you can see, race by race, the points that they gained. So, with Stake only getting points in Cutter, that was kind of hurting them going out through the season. They having a better trend line going up, about the same as Williams, in fact. But, with only the points in Cutter, that kind of hurt them quite a bit. They didn't get any lucky points earlier on in the season. I know they were trying to fight for some of those in point positions a couple of times, but didn't quite make it to that spot. But we see here Williams doing a decent job, gaining a couple of points in 3 races, and then Coda getting that 1 point, but had their big jump in Azerbaijan where they got 10 points. And so that kind of pulled them up out of the menial point scoring positions and doing a rather good job there. And just to show you a little bit different version of that, we have the step graph of this. So we have them, Williams gaining points in Imola and slowly working their way up to the points that they ended the season with, whereas you have Stake at the dead zero for their points until till Cutter, where they ended up gaining that 4 points in Cutter. And so not near enough points for the Stake F1 team compared to the Williams to be really any kind of where competitive to them, not being consistent enough in their runnings, falling in the back of the pack, not being able to put pressure on that team at all. And so hopefully Stake will be able to recover from that and be able to, I know they were starting to get better at the end of the season, so hopefully they can pull that off, and we will see how that plays out in the future. So that kind of concludes first stack up for Stake. So what's coming up next? We have where Williams is, of course. We're going to start off with Williams and kind of work our way forward. So hopefully that'll give us a little glimpse onto where they stand as well. So until then, farewell, and I will see you on the grid.